Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'll wait another minute until everybody is settled before we start the program. I'm Christian Escoven. I'm the president of the Coronado Roundtable. I know I've been absent for a while on vacation, but I'm back, and I'd like to thank Dave Bean, who was the interim MC, and Dave is here. So thank you, Dave, for filling in for me. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful morning. I see we've just about have all the seats full, so that's a great tribute to our speaker this morning, which I'll get to in just a bit. And thank you, Lyman Green, for preparing the coffee. Thank you, Lyman. Now, please, if you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. As you may know, our programs are recorded for live Zoom. So for those viewing at home, please mute your computer or device, and please also turn off your camera. You may also use your chat box for the question and answer portion of the program. And for that, we'd like to thank the library staff members, Selena Villadolid and Tara Davies. Thank you. The program should be presented on the library's YouTube channel. Our next program next month will be July 28th at 10 a.m. here in the Win Room, and we will feature Dr. Stephen Phillips, who will be speaking about his surgical experience treating heart attacks, performing bypass operations, and heart transplants. So that should be
Business development.
That should be exciting. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize one of our emeritus board members in declining health for his 40 years of service, and that is Roy Mance. Many of you may remember Roy Mance. He was a fixture here, always getting the room ready in the days, especially when we had to set up all the chairs and all the AV ourselves. Roy Mance, a real gentleman and a scholar. But today I'm excited to introduce our special guest and your speaker, a board member of the Roundtable, retired Vice Admiral Charles Martoglio, who will be speaking on the topic America and the World in 2030, Competition, Confrontation, or Conflict. Vice Admiral Martoglio, U.S. Navy retired, is an advisor to a wide variety of academic, corporate, healthcare, and civic organizations, as well as to the U.S. government. His focus is national security, international relations, and strategic leadership. He spent half of his 40-year military career in the U.S. Navy at sea in cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, including command of the Ronald Reagan Aircraft Carrier Strike Group. He spent the other half of his career developing strategy and leading military operations, initially for the US Navy, then for all US military forces. He is a recognized expert in strategic planning. He continues to be an active contributor to our nation's security, advising and speaking non-politically on issues impacting America, especially those in Europe and Asia. Additionally, he teaches master's level grand strategy and defense policy at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. Admiral Martoglio is a 1978 graduate of the US Naval Academy, and he holds a master's degree with highest distinction in in national security and strategic studies from the US Naval War College. Admiral Martoglio is married to the former Darlene Lewandowski. Please stand, Darlene, and be recognized. She is herself a multi-award-winning commercial banking executive. They are both active in San Diego's community and live in Coronado. Please welcome Admiral Charles Martoglio.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. As I look around the group assembled here this morning, I see friends and associates from all walks of life that have impacted me, that have impacted Darlene, and we appreciate it. I'm also a little humbled because I look out, I see about half a dozen people that I used to work for when I was moving up to the position that I currently fill. So I am very grateful for all of you coming here today. This is an easy draw. What could be more topical than what we're going to talk about for about the next hour or so? There is so much going on in the world today, from Russia, Ukraine, to what's going on inside of Europe, to what China's doing, to North Korea, to the Middle East and Iran, to transnational issues, and they all impact our national security. And we're going to touch on all of those as we go through our discussion, which is really going to focus on what's going on today, how is the world reacting to it, and what is the world going to look like in 2030, and how is that going to impact us? So let's go ahead and start. Some of you know that I always bring lots of slides. And some of you know, Bonnie, that I put lots of words on my slides. That's designed in large measure for the visual impact that there's some substance behind what I'm saying. So all you really need to do is listen. And I'll point out the important parts of the slides as we go along. But you also know that I rarely get to the end of my slides because of time limits. And so what I like to do right at the very beginning is, if you remember nothing else about what I talk about, these are the takeaways that I ask you to leave with. The first is, the primary driver of the next 10 years in the world of international security and international dimensions is this great power competition that you hear about. But more specifically, what are we competing about? What is the great power competition? It comes down to two key facets: how you're governed and how your economy runs. Both of those are pretty important issues to all of us sitting here: how we're ruled and how we make money. Without question, China is determined to win this competition. But as you know from a lot of the media that you're seeing today, it's not a slam dunk for China, and they're facing increasing headwinds, and there's lots of uncertainty associated with how China is doing in the world today. As you think about the great power competition and what's going on with Russia, Ukraine, you know, the title of my discussion is Cooperation, Confrontation, or Conflict. Cooperation on one side, competition, confrontation, and conflict. Russia, Ukraine is the first conflict in the great power competition. Everything else is to the left of conflict, either confrontation, competition, or in some cases, cooperation. Putin is crusading. Some of you have heard me speak on Ukraine. And when I get asked about Putin, what is he doing? Putin is on a crusade. Historic definition of crusade. You go until you can't go anymore. And that's what Putin's doing. That also means that Ukraine, if successful from a Russian perspective, is not the end state for Putin. He is on a crusade that will continue as long as he has the wherewithal to do that. Middle nations, nations like India, like Indonesia, like Brazil, they look to preserve their neutrality in this great power competition. They don't want to be forced to take sides because the economy drives most of their decisions. And they won't make a security decision until they absolutely have to, until one of their vital national interests is threatened. In 2030, the world is likely going to be bipolar, a democratic free market economy pole and an authoritarian state-sponsored capitalism pole. The variables being, how do we get to this bipolar world? Do we get there by waking up every morning and seeing what's going on in the world and adjusting our policy? Do we get there by sitting down and talking with the other side and negotiating a way to ensure that we don't get into conflict? Or is there a war? Those are the only three ways to get to the future. And then how deep is that bipolarity? Are we two completely separate poles, or is there some overlap between the poles, especially for areas where we must cooperate? Things like climate change, for example. Both sides have to take action, and the same types of action, to forestall that kind of disaster. Food insecurity, health insecurity, areas where our interests overlap. Bipolar world, the variables are how do we get there and how deep is the polarity. The banner at the bottom, if you only remember one thing out of this, if you don't remember all the takeaways, the one thing I would ask you to remember is in this great power competition, neither side has to win, but neither side can afford to lose. So we don't have to beat the authoritarian state-sponsored capitalist, but we can't lose to the authoritarian state-sponsored capitalist, or what happens? Our governance model becomes authoritarian, becomes Chinese, becomes directive. And our economy is no longer based on market forces, it's based on state-sponsored capitalism. So while we don't have to beat the other side of the great power competition. We don't have to win the competition. We can't afford to lose, or things that are vital to the United States of America and all of our friends and allies around the world get submerged. That's what we're going to talk about over about the next 45 minutes. Pretty simple, huh? I love this slide. Nobody else does. Bonnie gasps in horror every time she sees it. This is an impact slide. What impact do I want it to make? The impact is the banner at the bottom of the slide. I update this slide every time I go on stage because it's always dynamic. These are all of the things that are going on in the world in the international dimension that impacts the security of the United States of America. This is what Washington is watching every single day and looking to take action to make sure our vital national interests are protected. So your reaction when I put this slide up was exactly the right reaction. There's a lot of stuff going on all the time. And everything up there is complex. Nothing is easy. If it was easy, it wouldn't be up there. It would be fixed. And everything up there is interrelated to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 other issues. So as you try to fix one of them with a seemingly simple bumper sticker solution, you're really complicating 2, 3, 4, or 5 other issues, making them worse for us. This is extraordinarily difficult stuff at an extraordinarily challenging time in our history to try to tackle all this stuff. A large number of issues, they're all hard and they're all interrelated. You can't fix one in isolation. Great power competition. Competitors, America, our allies and partners versus China, Russia. That's what the great power competition is. That's the players in the great power competition. The arena where this competition is taking place is in how we are governed. Democracy on one side, and democracy with a small d, meaning that there are lots of different types of democracy out there. It's not a US one size fits all, but the key cornerstone is people get a choice in who governs them. So governance is the large area where the competition is taking place. As nations try to figure out, are they going to be a real democracy, however the nation defines that within that broad scope, or are they going to be authoritarian? The second arena is the economic systems. And I talk about a free market, and you hear that a lot. But, and this is a very sophisticated audience in terms of economics, is it really a free market? Is that a true statement? Yeah, you know, it is relatively, but it's a regulated market, right? Our market works within rules. But what is a free market? A free market is where supply and demand are in play and determine outcomes, and resources flow to the place where they get the greatest return on investment, all without the government having to do things. In other words, the government isn't deciding who the winners and losers are. On the state-sponsored capitalism side, you have the heavy hand of the government. The government is on all corporate and company boards. The government makes inexpensive loans available to state-sponsored enterprises, state-owned enterprises. They make regulations favorable to state-owned enterprises. And so the government is choosing the winners and losers, and all decisions as to how that plays out are highly centralized. They're not decentralized like they are in a free market or regulated market. So that's the second arena where this competition is taking place. It's also taking place in the international domains. And a lot of us in the audience today made our living in the international domain of the high seas and international airspace, right? The international domains, the high seas, international airspace, space, and cyberspace. Those are the international domains. What is an international domain? An international domain is a domain, an area where anybody can operate because nobody regulates the international domains. The laws in the international domains are such that everybody has free access to the international domains. Sea space, airspace, space, and cyberspace. And then lastly, geography. This is perhaps where people tend to focus the most in the great power competition. And it still is important. Where do we see this in play? Around the periphery of China and Russia. You hear terms like the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Russian near periphery. But increasingly, you also hear nations like China looking to increase their influence in South America, Central America, Europe, now Cuba. So geography still plays an important role in the great power competition. But as Americans, why are we so interested in this? Because this competition really is about governance type and economic systems. Who's going to govern us and how is our economy going to work? What's the prize? The prize is security. Why is security important? Because security is a prerequisite for self-determination. And self-determination, your ability to influence things, is a prerequisite for prosperity. And the more prosperous you become, the more options you have on how you use that prosperity. On an individual level, on a regional level, on a state level, on a federal level, on an international level. If you're not prosperous, you can have the best ideas in the world and you can't execute them. Why? Because you don't have the resources. It all comes down to the resources to execute those things that you feel are important in terms of self-determination. You decide what's important. And in order to be able to do that, the prerequisite is security. Again, neither side has to win, but neither side can afford to lose. Another slide with a lot of words. The left side of the slide is intentionally dense. You know, people have this fixation that China is this unstoppable force. It's not. The left side of the slide, I could make 3 slides as dense as this with all of China's problems that President Xi has to face every morning when he wakes up. When I talk about Chinese headwinds, there really are headwinds blowing on President Xi. And he knows that. And why do you think he is so touchy on things like balloons being shot down, on things like terminology for how he's governing? It's because he's under enormous pressure. He's been in power now almost 11 years. Everything revolves around him. So all of these problems are his problems. And he's getting sensitive to that. Why does China act? Some of you have heard me speak before. Very true as it is today, as it was 40 years ago. There was a handshake between the Chinese leadership, the Communist Party of China, Chinese Communist Party, and the people. And the handshake is something like this. If you allow me to govern uncontested, I promise I will give you a better life every single year. That's the handshake between the governed and the government in China. And that worked really well for about the first 35 years post-Mao. But starting about 2010 or so, maybe 2015, the government lost their ability, or is losing their ability to deliver on that handshake with their people. They cannot continue to deliver a better life year in and year out to the Chinese people. And so what do you see President Xi doing? You see President Xi increasing internal repression because he knows the people aren't as satisfied as they once were. And externally, he talks about the China dream, China's place in the world as the preeminent world power. And he sees an opportunity to try to make that happen a little bit faster because of all the things that are going on in the world that I had up on an earlier slide. And that plays into Chinese nationalism, which again assists him in controlling the internal dissatisfaction because the Chinese people are proud of what President Xi is ostensibly accomplishing on the global stage. So that's why Xi is acting. The root cause is the handshake is no longer as firm as it once was, meaning he needs to tamp down internal opposition, exploit external opportunities, and use that as nationalism fodder to keep the people proud of what China is doing, because the economic reward isn't there like it used to be. That's why Xi is doing what he is doing. And as I've said several times in past discussions here, the number one priority, the lens through which everything else Xi views, is how does it affect the Chinese Communist Party? Everything Xi does is to preserve the party's primacy. It's got a lot of challenges, a lot of challenges. I want to put this slide up just because, here I am talking about an authoritarian state. And it's kind of a amorphous term. It can mean a lot of different things. But I want to show you what is actually in place in China today, enabled by technology. Big data, smart systems, the ability to collect information. And I'm going to ask each of you just to quietly, nobody say anything, think about your life. Think about your pay record, your health record, your bank accounts, every email you've ever written, every thought you've ever expressed to a friend or another person. And think about what that means if you have the ability, or the government has the ability, to collect that information on a massive scale and put it all in one place. And then use that information to assign every single one of you, every 1.4 billion people in China has a social credit score. What do you think the social credit score is? It's the individual's reliability to the Communist Party of China. How reliable are you to me, President Xi? And if you're reliable, I'm going to take good care of you. And if you're not so much. And you may say, well, I'm a big guy, I can handle that. I'm going to stand on my ethics. But it's not just you. It's your parents. It's your relatives. It's your children. And when you buck the system in China, every associate is then at risk. Look on the right side of the slide. What does this social credit score determine? Where you can live, your job, where you can be outside of the borders of China, inside the borders of China, in your city, in your state, in your region. Do you get health care? And how good is it? Where do you go to school? Do you go to school? Do we educate your children? What do you have access to? What can you read? You can see what's on that slide. That's what an authoritarian government is. We're talking about pretty serious stuff here. It's not this ethereal, theoretical idea. This is what an authoritarian government is. "40 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, many of us, including me, were in the group that said, let's bring China along with us because we integrate them into the free market, regulated market way of doing things. And that's the best way to increase the prosperity for all future generations. So why now are we taking a tougher stance against China? Why didn't that work? They're actively promoting a competing governance and economic systems and demonstrating their intent to take it globally unless somebody gets in their way. Instead of liberalizing, China is now more aggressive externally and repressive internally. The competition has morphed into confrontation hacking, threatening, bullying, extorting, stealing, espionage, and not just against the United States, against almost all nations in the world. You can see globally contested borders all around China. They ignore world opinion. They want to write the rule sets for technology. That's one of the bipolarizations that's already going on. Separate information technology spheres, because our rule sets tend to be open and permissive, and the Chinese rule sets are just the opposite. So this is about authoritarianism and state-sponsored capitalism, because they are threats to America, America's friends, and democracy. I put this slide up just to show that as you look at cooperation, competition, confrontation, and conflict, that left to right spectrum, there are places that we can and should cooperate globally. Things where we have common interests. And then you've got things where we compete, things where we're confronting each other, South and East China Sea, industrial policy, cyberspace, human rights. Increasingly, technology is moving into confrontation as opposed to competition. And the one place where with China, we have the potential for conflict is Taiwan. Interestingly enough, this slide is designed to have a fulcrum on this balance. And where this fulcrum rests is determined by internal politics as much as by external politics on both sides. The takeaway: work together when interests intersect, compete aggressively when they diverge. You confront to deter the adversary from moving into the conflict regime. And you avoid conflict for anything except vital national interests. In other words, you don't go to war for reasons less than vital national interests. Rhetorical question: is governance and an economic system a vital national interest? Yeah, I think they are. Are you willing to just roll over and be governed by an authoritarian? That's not America. And are you willing to let the government choose the winners and losers through state-sponsored capitalism? Or are you a supporter of regulated free markets? How you manage your economy. Again, these are big issues we're talking about here today. Quickly talk about Russia. Russia actually put out a national security strategy in early 2021, about a year before Russia-Ukraine. Had three primary tenets: return the Russian Federation to great power status. You can kind of see the sub-bullets there. Strengthen political and social stability. Strengthen the government's hold over its people. And then improve the quality of life for Russian citizens. I put that in gray because even prior to Ukraine, Russia didn't have enough resources to really execute all three of those overarching tasks. And it is all about the resources. So they were able to do some things. But pre-Ukraine, what was one of the least popular things that Putin did pre-Ukraine to his people. He increased the age of their ability to draw a pension. And he increased it to 65 years. And what's the average mortality rate pre-Ukraine of a Russian male? 64 and a half. Can't make this stuff up. So he knew he had some challenges, but that was his strategy. At the bottom is the one takeaway from this slide, because this plays in how we get to 2030. Putin's goal is to strengthen Russia to be an independent, co-equal pole, not in a bipolar world, in a multipolar world, subordinate to no nation. Who's Putin talking to? America? Europe? China. And this was pre-Ukraine. I also on the slide list Putin's Ukraine objectives, but we're not going to go into all those today. I would point out, though, that none of them are being achieved. So let's talk about the Russian people. Putin, how long has Putin been in power? Yeah, somebody said 20, that's right, 23 years, right? Since the year 2000. He had a 4-year window from 2008 to 2012 when he was the prime minister instead of the president. President Medvedev was the president then, but Putin was still the power behind the throne. From 2012 to 2020, there was optimism with Putin as the president. The people of Russia were optimistic. He was delivering on stability, a sense of pride. The economy was doing well. Even the military forays were going okay from a Russian perspective. Russia was again stretching its international influence in the post-Cold War era. That started to change around 2020. So for about 2 years, again, all of this is pre-Ukraine. This pride that the Russian people felt was beginning to wane. And when you play the nationalism card, when you're stoking nationalism to make people proud and to justify your position, you've got to continually feed that nationalism beast. I can't make you proud one day and 3 years later say, hey, 3 years ago, I did something really well. How do you feel about me today? You got to continually feed that nationalism beast. Russians were still proud, but they wanted more. Patience was wearing thin. This systemic corruption in Russia was really getting to bother the people. Why? Because it was impacting the resources that they were able to get from the government. So now all of a sudden, nationalism isn't working, there's less resources, and the people are getting a little bit unhappy. So you got to feed that nationalism beast because there are no more resources. So what do? You whip up an imaginary conflict in order to justify going to war, which you think is going to last 3 days, in order to feed that nationalism beast. So where are we today with the Russian people? This is the people I'm trying to represent here. 4-part divide inside Russia. There's a group that says, whatever comes, we'll stand up to it. That's kind of the Russian way. It has always been the Russian way. You got the nationalists You see guys like Prigozhin, head of the Wagner groups, getting a lot of press lately. Bad news if he comes to power. He's a nationalist, and he's a hawk, and he's a fighter, and he's extraordinarily dangerous. You have those who want to leave Russia. Many have already left Russia. Then you have an increasing number of people who are vocalizing, hey, we deserve better than this. War is getting more dangerous. Again, this is what the Russian people are thinking. They don't want world war, and they don't want mobilization. They know their future is weaker, but what they really fear, more than defeat in Ukraine, is a return to the internal chaos of the post-Yeltsin years, when there was no law. It was every person for themselves, and it really was dog eat dog. So they look at Putin and they say, he's hurting us. We're not doing so well globally. He's not achieving war aims. He's probably not doing us any favors, but the alternatives are worse. So we'll stick with Putin for now. Focuses on their own lives, not politics. But the Russian people do broadly recognize that a favorable outcome in Ukraine is not likely. Ukraine, Russia's 5-part strategy, it's all about buying time. As long as this goes on, Putin's relatively stable and relatively happy. Dig in and hold. At a minimum, they're looking to protect this land bridge that you hear about. This is Russia in green. This is Crimea, which Russia annexed successfully in 2014, but it's not internationally recognized. And the only way pre the Ukraine war to supply Crimea was by sea and by a bridge, which you may remember the Ukrainians blew up about a year ago across the Kerch Strait going into the Sea of Azov. This is the land bridge which connects Russia via Ukrainian territory to Crimea. That is the least aggressive of the alternatives or the objectives that Putin has talked about for the Ukrainian campaign. All the other ones are currently beyond Russia's capability. This is the last ditch justification that Putin can use for continuing the war, to ensure a land bridge to his Russian compatriots in the Crimea. And you hear about the Ukrainian counteroffensive that has started, and it is going to go slow. And it's going to be a slog, and it's going to have casualties on both sides, because unlike previous Russian campaigns, Russia has had time to build anti-tank trenches, anti-personnel mines, anti-transport structures to keep the Ukrainians from being able to get into this area of the land bridge, because what Ukraine wants to do is sever the land bridge and then slowly take back the rest of the Ukrainian territory. But Russia has made it very, very hard and costly to do that. This isn't a big army audience, but some of you have joint experience. So what do you do if somebody puts up barriers? Yeah, you go around them. You go around them. Why isn't, in this case, what you do is an airborne assault, right? Why can't Ukraine do that? They don't have the ability to achieve air superiority over that portion of Ukraine. They can defend themselves against Russian air attacks, but they can't establish air superiority, which is a prerequisite for an airborne campaign behind the enemy's lines. So when you hear about things like F-16s, that's what we're really talking about, is the ability to defend over the active battle space so that you have all options available for countering Russia. Having said that, again, I'm kind of going into a Ukraine discussion here, and I don't mean to do that. The most important objective is making sure this war doesn't spread to NATO unless it's in our vital national interests. And so as you say, well, let's just give them F-16s, let's just give them long-range rockets, let's just give them ballistic missiles. The leadership is trying to manage with a rheostat how far you push Russia, how hard you push Russia to ensure that it doesn't become a NATO-Russia fight, which I believe is the right approach. You do see Russia continuing the air campaign against Ukraine. You see Putin threatening use of tactical nuclear weapons, suppressing resistance on the home front inside of Russia, and playing the uncertainty of the China card. Ukraine's strategy: sever the land bridge, recover the rest of the front. They are striking Russian command and control, logistics dumps and supply lines, challenging the border areas. They are going deep in an effort to keep Russia from commanding and controlling and supplying their forces in Ukraine. But they're not going deep into Russia. At least they're not acknowledging going deep into Russia. Strategy is to maintain coalition support. Ukraine will not survive without coalition support. It will stop surviving as a nation. And Putin's a crusader. Is he going to stop at Ukraine if he wins? Only if he's run out of energy. He'll keep going until he runs out of energy. He needs, this is again, Zelensky, Ukrainian side needs to preserve national will and back diplomacy that maximizes NATO's commitment today and into the future. Banner at the bottom. It's Putin's crusading versus Ukraine's national will. That's not their army's success. That's their people's national will. And the coalition and coalition support sticking together behind Ukraine. Those are the three things that will determine how this unfolds. I'm going to skip some slides just because I see Darlene looking at me from the back saying, Charlie, you're going on to a full hour now. You know, some of us who've gone through senior service colleges, there's a term called the hook. And the hook is the person in the audience who, when the speaker goes too long, you kind of slide up to the speaker and say, it's time. I may be a former 3-star admiral, but the agreement I have with Darlene, no matter how senior I get, she has one more star or one more stripe over me. And she's my hook. Talk very quickly about China, Russia, the strategic alliance. There's a lot of reasons why they're cooperating. Mostly because they don't like America and America's position in the world. Is this surprising? Is this historically inaccurate? It's not. This is a traditional balance of power play. I would say half of the people in this room will remember what I'm about to say because you were alive and thinking during that period of time, understanding world events. And that was the Nixon rapprochement with China. Only Nixon can go to China. Why did Nixon go to China? That was a balance of power play against the Soviet Union. China and America teaming up against the Soviet Union. We're kind of going full circle, or at least half circle right now, with China and Russia seeking to balance a balance of power against America and America's allies. This is how the world has evolved for thousands of years through balances of power, either on the very local level, the regional level, the state level, the national level, the tribal level, the cultural level. And that's what's happening here. That's the rationale for cooperation. But there's an awful lot of suspicion between the Russians and the Chinese. China is so far observing the sanctions on Russia, but China is stealing, remember that hacking, bullying, cajoling portion that I talked about earlier relative to what China is doing? They're doing the same thing to Russia. Their government, their businesses, their military. After Ukraine, there is no doubt that China will replace Russia as the next global arms supplier behind the United States. Russia's very concerned with China's Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is how China seeks to engage that outside world and tie that outside world to China through trade, through economic incentives. Why is Russia concerned with that? Because it goes right through the Russian near periphery, which is part of the justification that Putin uses to go into Ukraine. Putin believes he has this sphere of influence around Russia that he and the Russian state get to control because they build these buffer zones through which any antagonists have to get through in order to get to Russia and threaten Russia. China and their Belt and Road Initiative threatens vast amounts of Russian near periphery. You can see the rest there. Interesting. Russia supports India and Vietnam. Who are two of China's antagonists right now? China and Vietnam. Russian activity in the Middle East. Anyway, come back to the banner at the bottom of Putin's strategy slide. Russia's intent is to be an independent pole in a multipolar world. What does China plan to do with Russia? China, in this balance of power, wants to ensure Russia stays subordinate, less powerful, and a junior partner to Chinese leadership. So you have this friction despite the seeming comity between Putin and Xi. Are things going to break up with them in the next week, 2 months, years? Probably not. But you will see increased fissures because all balances of power eventually break apart. Very quickly, what I try to show on this slide from the Chinese perspective, we talk about China so far honoring the US sanctions or observing the US sanctions. Why shouldn't China, from a Chinese perspective, arm Russia? We've talked about their economy. It's pretty fragile. They do espouse and have a history of non-intervention, more espoused than historical today. The potential for internal unrest. They are looking to limit the decline of US and ally relations, or at least control how quickly they decrease. Reputational impact, because Russia is an international pariah today, and it will be for a long time to come. They have no desire for a proxy war with the US, mostly because their economy isn't doing too well. On the other side, why would they arm Russia? Everything Xi has done since he's come to power reverses the Chinese policy pre-Xi, which is economy over everything else. In Xi, because the economy is getting soft, he needs to increase internal repression and exploit external opportunities to feed nationalism. It's national security over the economy. He likes this balance of power with Russia. Xi likes this balance of power with Russia. He sees Russia not doing so well, and Russia's my one and only real partner in this great power competition, unlike America that has many partners. It would minimize the likelihood of Russian escalation if Russia could stabilize the front and show some victories. China believes it's too big to sanction, but one of the things that's come out of Ukraine that China has kind of sucked in their breath at is a lot of people thought the same thing about Russia and Russian energy. And it could be a test platform for Chinese weapons. What's in the best interest of the Communist Party of China? Not what's in the best interest of China. What's in the best interest of the Communist Party of China will determine which side of this balance eventually gets accommodated. India. I'm going to press through the next couple slides because I don't want to go too long, and I do want to hit a couple things at the end. You know, the Indian Prime Minister's in Washington. He was with the president yesterday. There are a lot of good reasons for India and the US teaming together. Many more today than there were yesterday. And the trajectory is moving in that direction. But there are still some challenges, as you can see on the right-hand side. As the banner at the bottom says, India is looking to preserve its strategic neutrality. It wants to preserve its ties to Russia. Why? Mostly because more than half of their military equipment comes from Russia. And you would say, well, they've already got it. But as all of us in the real world know, it's about how do you sustain it? How do you maintain it? How do you resupply it? And that's where Russia has a little bit of a lock vice on India, at least for the next decade, maybe two. They're looking to improve ties with the US, and they want to increase their leadership role among the neutral nations in the great power competition. India, great nation, huge potential. India is for India. And as national level policymakers, we can never forget this. They will be with us when it's in their interests. They will not support us when there are reasons in their national interests not to support us. But I maintain that's every nation on the face of the earth. all nations act in their own self-interest all the time without exception, including America. Bunch of wild cards out there, things that could upset this move towards a balance of power. I'll give you just a second to read that because I don't want to go too much longer. And as the banner at the bottom says, unfortunately, that list is not unreasonable. And a more positive side. One of the themes that we've talked about is the economy and resources. Why are resources good? Resources give you the option to do things. Without resources, you can't do anything. You know, whether you are conservative or liberal, if you don't have any resources, you can't do anything. Resources give you options to make decisions. So in the world that we live in, it's not necessarily ideology, authoritarianism and democracy. It's about how do you generate the resources to support the programs that you're interested in. The only thing I'm going to talk about on this slide is where the blue arrow is, gross domestic product. America and our allies, NATO and Asia, have a combined gross domestic product of about $55 trillion a year. That's the summation of goods and services produced by all of the nations that are America, NATO, or our allies. America represents about 25 trillion of that. America and Europe combined is about 45 to 50 trillion. China today is about $18 trillion a year. Russia, 1.48, less than the state of California. And I put India in gray there because you really can't count them in the NATO and allies column. So I've got 55 trillion in resources on one side and about 20 on the other. Where are you going to place your money? I'm going with the 55 trillion club because resources give you options. Every element of national power is enhanced with friends and allies. This slide also is designed to say, we can't go it alone. We must have friends and allies and partners alongside of us. That's the big takeaway from this slide. One is the economic overmatch, which you must capitalize on, because if you don't capitalize on the economic overmatch, you got the military side to fall back on, and you don't want to do that unless you really have to. And you got to have friends and allies. What does the future look like? On the left side, these are the different types of futures that could be out there. Everything from anarchy to supranational governance, kind of a United Nations on steroids. Don't throw me off the stage. What I've tried to do here, though, is array them in terms of their likelihood. And the range of likely futures is really a multipolar world. Russia, China, US, maybe Europe. A bipolar world, authoritarians and democracies. Some sort of limited return to globalization. Why was globalization a good thing? Why is globalization a good thing? Because it is the most efficient way to achieve return on investment. If you can produce something for half of what you can produce it, and I'm the investor, where's my money going to go? And it just flows automatically to wherever I get the greatest return on investment based on supply and demand. I'm not going to invest in something where there's no demand or where there's oversupply. So those rules of economics come into play, and globalization is an incredibly effective way of running a global economy. Unless you can't share everything. As I said at the beginning, we can get to this future, most likely a bipolar world right now, along three paths. Conscious and peaceful design. That's you and me sitting down and talking about what we want this world to look like and agree on how we're going to accommodate each other in a balance of power. Or we can wake up every morning and see what's going on in the world and say, well, here's how I'm going to adjust my policy today. And the other side of the world wakes up and they say, here's how I'm going to adjust my policy today. Or war. Those are the three ways to get to the future. Which do you think is the best? I'm not going to even talk about this slide other than to say, anybody who doesn't believe we're heading to a bipolar world doesn't know what's going on in the world. For a long time, even businesses said it's never going to happen. It's happening, and business knows it, and they're taking action now to protect themselves and their supply chains and their investment opportunities. Driven by government policy on both sides, increasingly acknowledged by business. Coming to the end, give me 2 or 3 more minutes. Cooperation in a bipolar world. On the left side of the slide, I array categories of things that you can share in a purely globalized world. If I trust everybody around the world, we're globalized, we're getting huge efficiency on our return on investment. The world is working and clicking along really well, and things are good. But if I don't trust, if other groups are looking to exploit either my vulnerabilities or steal things from me, because it is a market economy, where do I draw the line going down this list? Because down here are things that we really ought to cooperate on. Up here, if you don't trust the other side, not so much. So as you come over to our bipolar world, where do you set this intersection point so that you're getting the most benefit from cooperation, you're most efficient, you're achieving your objectives for the least amount of resources, and yet you're not trading away the farm to the adversary who will either use it against you militarily, diplomatically, or economically. So if you believe, as I do, that talking to the other side is important, not just to shunt to ground miscommunication or misunderstanding, but to shape a world in which you're not doing tit for tat salami slicing or going to war. It's that negotiation option. You got to talk to the other side. It's all about where do you set this intersection point so that you're cooperating in the things where you've got to cooperate and you're not giving away the farm to things that an untrusted adversary may use against you. Finish with this slide. I've used this slide thousands of times in lectures. Everybody here has sat through prognostications that America is a sunset empire. America's best days are behind us. On the left side of the slide are some times when pundits made that case. Korea, Sputnik, misery index of the 80s. You can read what's on the left-hand side of the slide. Many, many times in our lifetime, people have said, America is a sunset empire. Its best days are behind us. And yet, we're still the most powerful, most influential, most economically influential nation, not only on the earth today, but in the history of the world. Why is that? If you look at the rest of this slide, I've listed things where America is the undisputed leader of the world in these categories or attributes. And if we're not the undisputed leader, we might be tied or a high second. And only America, no other nation, has a list with all these bullets on it. Some of them are just lucky. Some of them have taken generations to produce. And some of them are good governance. But they're all the attributes that when you wrap them up together, this is what gives America its position in the world today. And no other nation anywhere has a list that long and that sophisticated and that important. So here's my get off the stage line. This is what makes America work. This is what makes America great. And you muck with this list at great peril to our nation. And I'm going to stop now and turn it back over to Christian. And I thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned a few things.